project is about the ethics of refugee resettlement in the United States. Is the team ready to come up? This team combines expertise in law, human rights, international relations, and practical experience of working with refugees. And their goal was to create an ethical and human rights framework to help guide decisions on numbers of refugees to be resettled in the United States. They have interviewed a broad range of stakeholders, including refugee groups, think tanks, former American Secretary for Refugees. When I heard some interim findings from the team, they said that 2 points stood out. That how stakeholders think about the justification for accepting refugees is subject to a broad consensus, and that has changed over the last 30 years. We would love to hear more about that and what you've learned. And please introduce yourselves when you are doing your presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leonard Rubenstein. I'm at the Center for Public Health and Human Rights at the Bloomberg School and core faculty of the Berman Institute. In the last year of the Obama administration, it decided to raise the number of refugees to be resettled to about 110,000 from the number of about 75 or 80,000 in recent years past. As soon as the Trump administration came in, that obviously, as you all know, a very different view, and instituted the travel ban, reviewed the refugee program, and initially lowered the number to about 50,000, and then this year to 30,000. There was a lot of ferment about that. But it also raised the question, is how do you think about determining the number? What are some ethical bases for determining that number, taking into account the many policy considerations at stake as well? And we had a wonderful team to look at this question. We had an expert in refugee policy, Paul Spiegel, who had spent many years at the UN High Commission for Refugees, Daniel Surwer at SICE, who has spent his entire career in foreign policy, mostly in war zones. We had two bioethicists, one Rachel Fabi and Govind Persad, and an expert in qualitative research. And we have had, with that diverse team, a lot of lively arguments and discussions about where we're going and how we come out. And we hope we're kind of on the right track and interested in your feedback. Rachel will present our findings.
Thank you, Len. So, first of all, we're talking about the number of refugees to be resettled in the United States. And when we talk about refugees, we're talking about people who have a well-founded fear of persecution due to their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or possession of a political opinion, who find themselves outside their country of nationality and are unable or unwilling to return home because of that fear of persecution. And estimates suggest that there are about 25.4 million refugees globally right now, which is the highest number in human history, out of 68.5 million people who are displaced. And so refugees as a group are distinct from people who are internally displaced. So they've been forced from their homes but are still in their country of origin. And they're also distinct from asylum seekers who are in the country in which they hope to claim refuge. So refugees are in a second country that is not the country in which they intend to stay. And as Len mentioned, the number of refugees that the United States resettles each year has changed dramatically over the past few years. So in 2016, the Obama administration set the ceiling at 85,000, and this is a little bit higher than the average we've seen, partially in response to the Syrian civil war. For 2017, they set it to 110,000, and this was in October of 2016 that this number was set, obviously right before the 2016 election. So when the Trump administration came in, they actually lowered that to 50,000, although only 33,000 were actually resettled. The following year, they set it to 45,000, so it was reduced again, and only about half of that number were actually resettled. And in September of this year, they announced that the new ceiling will be 30,000. So yet another reduction. And just to place this in sort of a broader context, you can see over the last 30, 40 years, the United States typically resettles around 75 to 80,000, although you see a couple of spikes following the end of the Cold War. We accepted more refugees for political reasons. And after 9/11, there was a drop as they sort of froze resettlement to reassess security protocols. But currently, as I mentioned, the ceiling is now 30,000. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended this decision, saying that this year's refugee ceiling reflects our commitment to protect the most vulnerable around the world while prioritizing the safety and well-being of the American people. And you can see in the statement sort of a tension between a moral obligation to protect vulnerable people, but also the sort of practical consideration of the safety of Americans and our sort of self-interest. Joseph Cairns, who's a political philosopher, wrote about this issue, saying that there's now, I fear, a deep conflict between what morality requires of democratic states with respect to the admission of refugees and what democratic states and their existing populations see as their interests. And so this tension between practical interests and moral obligations is something that came out of our interviews, which we were conducting to attempt to answer these two questions. So first, we were trying to determine how many refugees should be admitted for resettlement, what should the number be, and how should that number be determined. So to answer this question, we engaged in a review of the literature of both the moral and political theory, and we engaged key informants in interviews, and these were, I'll show you a table of sort of who these people were, and then we analyzed these interviews and also conducted a normative analysis of our findings. So you can see here some of the people that we interviewed. I'm actually blinded to who they are. I don't know who they are beyond their roles, but these were people who were from the State Department under the Obama administration, people engaged in resettlement, people from advocacy groups and think tanks, sort of across the political spectrum. But all people who had sort of background knowledge of what the resettlement process was like and how that number was reached. So from these interviews, three sort of major buckets of findings emerged. One was the policy goals of resettlement. Why do we do them? Why do we do this? The underlying moral values of resettlement, so what drives the moral obligation as these respondents saw it, and then also practical barriers to or facilitators of resettlement. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the quotes, although they are very interesting, but I'm going to talk through some of these themes. So the foreign policy goals that a number of our respondents described included this idea that resettlement, that the United States' resettlement, helps influence what other countries do. So when we accept more refugees, other countries accept more refugees because we're global leaders. And also that it helps to improve the stability of host countries. So if refugees have left their home country and they're now in a neighboring state, those states are destabilized by this influx of refugees, and that the United States, by taking some of these refugees out, it helps to stabilize the region. So it's a foreign policy goal. But it also, we can do this because the United States takes some of the more vulnerable cases, people who are sicker, have more medical needs, and that's another way to help stabilize the host country. People also described that our resettlement program is a way of standing by allies and our historical commitments to those allies. So for instance, Jordan has a large number of refugees. Jordan is a historic ally of the United States. So in taking refugees from Jordan, we are helping an ally. The domestic policy goals that our respondents described were largely those of the current administration. So the idea was that by taking fewer refugees, the Trump administration, as Secretary Pompeo's quote demonstrated, was intended to improve national security, although a number of our respondents disagreed that that was the actual outcome of reducing the ceiling, and that in fact, by reducing the ceiling, we send messages to people that certain populations aren't open here, and it actually harms our national security. Another common theme that our respondents described was that the current administration is intentionally conflating humanitarian resettlement policy with immigration policy for political reasons, that it was good for the current administration to essentially scapegoat refugees and lump them in with other immigrant populations. In terms of the underlying values, protecting the vulnerable was sort of the foremost value that people espoused, this idea that we resettled because we have this duty to rescue, especially the most vulnerable, those in harm's way. In the interest of time, because I see the yellow light, I'm not going to get into the rest of these now, but there were a number of values that people described, with vulnerability being the foremost. One quote that I will share with you, a respondent said, "I don't think we should be naive and say it's just vulnerability, because an endless number of people are vulnerable. So I don't dispute that there should be some political considerations, but hopefully it's not just that." So this idea that when we're setting the number, we should be considering vulnerability, but we also have these various barriers and facilitators that are practical that need to be taken into consideration as well. And these include the processing capacity, so this is the ability of the State Department to actually go out and interview people and make sure that they're vetted. And most of our respondents agreed that that capacity was actually determined by the budget. So by cutting the State Department's budget, we reduced processing capacity. We also heard a lot about community factors, and these are not things like prejudice or hatred of refugees or immigrants, but rather things like, is there affordable housing in the community, or can the public schools deal with an influx of non-English speaking students? And all of these things were driven by what respondents described as political will. So in our review of the literature, we saw a number of potential moral justifications for resettlement, and many of them mapped onto our findings. The one I'm going to focus on today is humanitarianism, which is this duty to rescue when costs are low. But I want to note that this conception of costs at the heart of humanitarianism is partly a social and political construct. So we argue that we should be working towards reshaping the political space to make it conducive to the reception of refugees and asylum seekers. And our final conclusion is that we're duly obligated to admit as many refugees as our processing capacity and community factors will allow, but also to actively seek to increase political will to support the resettlement program. And in terms of what should the number be, we are arguing for a reset to that historic average of 75 to 80,000, with the ability to increase as need, at which we anticipate will increases. And we also argue that dramatic departure should be approved by Congress, which is in keeping with its statutory oversight authority of this program. So I will stop there, and we can answer any questions in the Q&A.